It was a ruthless demolition spree, a century of architectural beauty and social legacy erased in just 4 decades. The finest mansions in America, built by the country's most powerful families, were methodically torn down to make room for parking lots and gas stations. The grand estates of the Vanderbilts, Astors, and Carnegies, once symbols of the country's Gilded Age opulence, were leveled for nothing more than the next modern project. But who was to blame for this shocking destruction? Was it progress or cultural vandalism? This is the untold story of how America tore down its own gilded past, literally. The American dream built on stone. The Gilded Age was a time of unimaginable wealth and architectural marvels that stretched across the American landscape like castles in the sky. Between 1870 and 1900, America transformed from a rural republic into an industrial empire. Fortunes materialized overnight. Steel magnates, railroad barons, and banking dynasties accumulated wealth that would be worth hundreds of billions in today's currency. And they built monuments to match their ambition. Cornelius Vanderbilt II erected a palace at 5th Avenue and 57th Street that covered an entire city block. The mansion contained 137 rooms. Marble imported from Italy lined the floors. French tapestries hung from walls 20 feet high. The main hall could accommodate 200 guests beneath gilded ceilings that mimicked the palace at Versailles. This was not unusual. Along 5th Avenue alone, between 50th and 96th Streets, over 200 mansions rose between 1880 and 1910. The Astors built 3 separate palaces. The Carnegies constructed a Georgian mansion with 64 rooms and a private art gallery. Henry Clay Frick created a neoclassical masterpiece that would later become a museum, but only after decades as a private home where old masters' paintings decorated, rooms used by a single family. These were not simply homes, they were declarations. Each mansion announced to the world that its owner had transcended ordinary limits. They had conquered markets, controlled industries, shaped the destiny of a nation. The architecture reflected this ambition. Gothic Revival estates mimicked European castles. Beaux Arts palaces echoed French royalty. Italian Renaissance villas transported Mediterranean grandeur to American soil. The scale was staggering. William Vanderbilt spent $3 million constructing a chateau on 5th Avenue in 1883. That equals roughly $90 million today. The housewarming party cost $250,000 for a single evening. 1,200 guests arrived in costume. The ballroom glittered with electric lights, still a novelty. One guest wore a taxidermied cat as part of her ensemble. Newport, Rhode Island, became the summer capital of this new American aristocracy. The Breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, contained 70 rooms spread across 138,000 square feet. The marble fireplace in the dining room weighed 50 tons. Italian artisans spent 2 years installing mosaic ceilings. The heating system required 22 furnaces and consumed coal by the boxcar. These mansions required armies to maintain. The Breakers employed a permanent staff of 40 servants. The Biltmore estate in North Carolina, built by George Washington Vanderbilt, needed 80 full-time employees just to keep the house operational. That mansion contained 250 rooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, and 3 kitchens spread across 178,000 square feet. The craftsmanship inside these homes represented the pinnacle of what human hands could create. Master artisans from Europe spent years carving wood panels, painting frescoes, installing stained glass windows. Each detail received obsessive attention. Doorknobs were cast in sterling silver. Light fixtures were designed by renowned sculptors. Entire rooms were purchased from European palaces, dismantled, shipped across the Atlantic, and reconstructed stone by stone. But beneath the gilt and grandeur, these mansions embodied something more than wealth. They represented a belief that great families could shape civilization through the force of their ambition and the permanence of their architecture. These were not temporary structures. They were built to last centuries, to house dynasties, to stand as eternal monuments to the families who created them. The owners genuinely believed their legacy would endure. The stones would outlast them. The families would continue. The names would echo through generations. America would remember them through the physical permanence of these extraordinary buildings. They were wrong. Within 40 years, most of these mansions would be demolished. The families would scatter, the fortunes would dissolve, and America would systematically erase nearly every trace of the architectural legacy that defined an entire era. What happened? The first crack in the foundation. As the country roared into the 20th century, the new economic realities began to encroach on the old world of grandeur. The year 1913 changed everything, though few realized it at the time. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution authorized a federal income tax. Initially modest, the tax rates climbed rapidly. By 1918, the top marginal rate reached 77%. Suddenly, the fortunes that seemed infinite became finite. The money that once flowed effortlessly into construction and staffing now drained toward the government. But income tax was only the beginning. Estate taxes emerged in 1916. Initially set at 10% for the largest estates, the rate climbed to 40% by 1935 and eventually peaked at 77%. Passing wealth between generations, once automatic, became a financial crisis. Many families faced an impossible choice: liquidate assets to pay taxes or watch the government seize property. The mansions, built as dynastic seats, became tax liabilities instead of family treasures. Consider the Vanderbilt family fortune. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877 with a fortune estimated at $100 million, approximately $2.5 billion in modern currency. His son doubled it. His grandson expanded it further. Yet by 1940, when the third generation died, estate taxes consumed $42 million in a single transfer. The family sold properties, liquidated investments, and watched their empire fragment. Property taxes compounded the problem. Manhattan real estate values skyrocketed through the early 20th century. A Fifth Avenue mansion sitting on land worth $50,000 in 1890 occupied land worth $5 million by 1930. Property tax bills climbed accordingly. Families paid annual taxes that exceeded what their grandparents spent building the entire house. The economic equation that made these mansions possible had reversed. In 1880, fortunes grew faster than costs. By 1930, costs grew faster than fortunes. Then came the Great Depression. Between 1929 and 1933, the stock market collapsed. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated. Families who thought themselves immune to financial worry discovered their wealth had been built on credit, speculation, and assumptions that no longer held. The mansion at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street that Cornelius Vanderbilt II built for $11 million stood empty by 1926. The family donated it to real estate developers. The building was demolished. Nobody wanted to buy it. The land underneath had become more valuable than the structure on top. This pattern repeated across America. In Chicago, Potter Palmer's Castle on Lakeshore Drive, built in 1882 for $1 million, was demolished in 1950. The land sold for redevelopment. In San Francisco, the James Flood Mansion, constructed from Connecticut brownstone, transported around Cape Horn, became the Pacific Union Club. Most other San Francisco mansions were demolished after the earthquake of 1906 and never rebuilt to their former grandeur. But economics alone did not kill these mansions. A cultural shift accompanied the financial pressure. The Progressive Era redefined American values. Wealth that seemed admirable in 1880 appeared vulgar by 1930. The vast inequality that created Gilded Age fortunes became politically unacceptable. Politicians campaigned on platforms promising to redistribute wealth, break up monopolies, and end dynastic accumulation. Public opinion turned against visible displays of excess. Newspapers that once celebrated mansion openings now criticized them as monuments to greed. Intellectuals questioned whether such concentration of wealth served the public good. Social reformers pointed to tenement poverty and asked whether million-dollar palaces could be justified when children lived in squalor blocks away. The mansions, once sources of pride, became embarrassments. Families stopped hosting grand balls. They closed entire floors. They withdrew from public view. The very visibility that made these home statements of achievement now made them targets of resentment. Zoning laws tightened. Cities that once welcomed mansion construction began restricting residential buildings. New York rezoned Fifth Avenue for commercial use. Chicago limited residential construction in prime downtown areas. San Francisco restricted building heights and lot coverage. The legal framework that protected these estates eroded. Servants became impossible to find. 2 world wars pulled workers into factories and military service. The immigrant labor pool that staffed these homes dried up. Labor unions formed, wages rose, working conditions improved. By 1940, hiring 40 servants to maintain a mansion cost more than most families earned in total. The social structure that made these homes operational had collapsed. Technology changed domestic life. Central heating, electric lighting, and modern appliances reduced the need for massive staffs, but increased operating costs. Older mansions, built for gas lighting and coal furnaces, required expensive retrofitting. Many families decided renovation exceeded the value of preservation. The first generation built these mansions. The second generation inherited them. The third generation sold them, and the fourth generation watched them demolished. But the destruction was not random. Forces beyond family choice and economic pressure were quietly coordinating. Behind the scenes, developers and politicians were making decisions that would erase an entire architectural legacy. The silent coup of modernity. The demolition of America's greatest homes was not the work of an external enemy, but a coordinated shift in culture and policy. Robert Moses understood the future belonged to automobiles, not aristocrats. As New York's master builder, he wielded power exceeding any elected official. Between 1930 and 1970, Moses demolished thousands of buildings to construct highways, parks, and public housing. Gilded Age mansions blocked his vision. They occupied land needed for bridges, parkways, and parking garages. Moses did not negotiate. He condemned. The legal mechanism was eminent domain. Governments could seize private property for public use, provided they paid fair compensation. But Moses redefined fair compensation and expanded public use until the law became a weapon. Mansions worth millions were seized for assessments of thousands. Owners who resisted faced years of litigation. Most gave up. Between 1935 and 1960, Moses demolished over 250 mansions in New York alone. The Henry Villard houses on Madison Avenue, the William Wetmore estate in the Bronx, the John Jacob Astor townhouses on Fifth Avenue. All gone. All replaced by highways, schools, or public facilities that served Moses's vision of modern urban planning. But Moses was not alone. Similar figures emerged in every major city. In Chicago, Mayor Richard Daley oversaw urban renewal that demolished entire neighborhoods. In San Francisco, Justin Herman cleared Victorian mansions to build the financial district. In Philadelphia, Edmund Bacon transformed Society Hill by removing 19th century estates. These men shared a philosophy. Old buildings represented old thinking, and progress required destruction. The phrase urban renewal became a euphemism for demolition. Federal housing acts in 1949 and 1954 provided billions in subsidies for cities to acquire and clear blighted areas. The definition of blighted was flexible. Any neighborhood deemed outdated qualified. Mansions built 50 years earlier became slums in bureaucratic paperwork. Developers recognized opportunity. Land values in city centers were climbing. A mansion occupying an entire block represented wasted potential. Demolish the house, subdivide the lot, construct an apartment building or office tower, and profits multiplied. The math was irresistible. Tax policy accelerated the trend. Depreciation rules favored new construction over renovation. Owners could deduct losses from deteriorating buildings, but gained no benefit from maintenance. The tax code incentivized abandonment. Let the mansion decay, claim the loss, sell the land, profit from redevelopment. Cultural institutions that might have preserved these buildings were complicit. Museums, universities, and foundations that could have purchased mansions as cultural assets instead remained silent. CU, Metropolitan Museum of Art, acquired individual rooms from demolished mansions, but made no effort to save entire structures. Harvard and Yale accepted donations of furnishings, but not the buildings containing them. The few attempts at preservation failed spectacularly. When developers threatened to demolish Pennsylvania Station in 1963, preservationists organized protests. Newspaper editorials decried the loss. Architecture critics called it vandalism. The demolition proceeded anyway. The station, a Beaux Arts masterpiece designed by McKim, Mead, and White, was torn down to build Madison Square Garden and an office complex. The outcry changed nothing. If Pennsylvania Station could not be saved, what chance did private mansions have? Architectural fashion turned against ornamentation. The international style celebrated clean lines, functional design, and rejection of historical references. Architects trained in this philosophy viewed Gilded Age mansions as embarrassing, excess. The profession that might have defended these buildings instead dismissed them as outdated kitsch. Real estate economics followed predictable patterns. As mansions deteriorated, property values declined. Lower values meant lower tax assessments. Lower assessments meant reduced municipal revenue. Cities responded by rezoning for higher density commercial use. Rezoning made residential mansions illegal. Owners had to either demolish or face violations. The cycle reinforced itself. Each demolished mansion made the next demolition easier. As the architectural fabric of neighborhoods changed, remaining mansions became anomalies. They blocked sidewalk improvements, interrupted building lines, and complicated utility installation. Urban planners viewed them as obstacles. Insurance companies refused to cover older buildings. Fire risk, structural concerns, and liability exposure made mansions uninsurable at any price. Without insurance, banks would not finance renovations. Without financing, owners could not maintain properties. Without maintenance, buildings deteriorated until demolition became the only option. Even families who wanted to preserve their homes faced insurmountable barriers. Converting mansions to museums required nonprofit status, endowments for maintenance, and regulatory approval. Most families lacked the expertise to navigate these requirements. They sold instead. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, founded in 1949, lacked resources and legal authority to intervene. They could designate buildings as historic landmarks, but designation carried no protection. Owners could demolish landmark buildings with minimal consequences. By 1960, the machinery of destruction operated automatically. Tax policy encouraged abandonment. Zoning mandated commercial use. Developers maximized profits through demolition. City planners prioritized modernization. Architects disdained historical styles. Insurance companies refused coverage. And families trapped in unsustainable financial situations had no choice but to sell. The question was no longer whether these mansions would survive. The question was how many and how quickly they would fall. Between 1920 and 1960, America demolished over 2,000 Gilded Age mansions. Some estimates suggest the number exceeded 3,000 when smaller estates and country homes are included. These were not abandoned ruins. Many remained structurally sound, architecturally significant, and historically important. They were demolished anyway. The machinery of progress, once set in motion, proved unstoppable. The battle of land and legacy. Behind each demolished mansion was a battle over land, value, and the very future of American identity. The fight for the William Wetmore estate in 1948 revealed the futility of resistance. Wetmore, a 19th century financier, built a Gothic revival mansion in the Bronx covering 12 acres. The house contained 80 rooms, multiple conservatories, and formal gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. The family maintained the property for 3 generations. Then New York City announced plans to build a highway through the estate. The Wetmore heirs hired lawyers. They challenged the city's eminent domain authority. They argued the highway could follow an alternate route. They presented architectural surveys proving the mansion's historical significance. They offered to donate portions of the property in exchange for preserving the house. The city ignored every argument. Robert Moses declared the highway alignment non-negotiable. The legal battle lasted 3 years. In 1951, bulldozers arrived. The mansion was demolished in 4 days. The land became an interchange between 2 expressways. Today, cars pass over the spot where the Wetmore family once lived, completely unaware of what existed beneath the pavement. This pattern repeated constantly. In Newport, the Wetmore family faced a different challenge with their summer cottage, Château-sur-Mer. Built in 1852 and expanded in 1872, the mansion represented early Gilded Age architecture. But property taxes climbed beyond the family's capacity to pay. By 1968, they faced a choice: sell to developers or donate to preservation. They chose donation. The Preservation Society of Newport County accepted the property with an endowment for maintenance. The mansion survived. But this outcome was exceptional. Most families received no offers from preservation organizations. They sold to the highest bidder, and the highest bidders were always developers. The battle for the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion at 5th Avenue and 57th Street demonstrated how even the most significant buildings could not be saved. When the family decided to demolish in 1926, protests erupted. Architects petitioned the city. Historical societies offered to purchase the property. The French government expressed interest in relocating the building to Paris. None of these efforts succeeded. The mansion was demolished in 1927. Bergdorf Goodman purchased the land and built a department store. The only remnants preserved were the main gates, relocated to the Conservatory Garden in Central Park. Everything else became rubble. The financial calculations were brutal. The mansion occupied land valued at $7 million. Maintaining the building cost $200,000 per year in property taxes alone, plus $300,000 for staff and operations. No use could generate sufficient income to cover these costs. Residential use had become economically impossible. Commercial conversion failed repeatedly. Several families attempted to transform their mansions into hotels, restaurants, or office buildings. Most efforts collapsed within years. The buildings were too expensive to adapt, too inefficient to operate, and too inflexible for modern commercial needs. The Henry Clay Frick Mansion on 5th Avenue survived only through extraordinary measures. Frick died in 1919 and left the building to become a public museum with a $20 million endowment. Even with this massive financial cushion, the museum struggled. Operating costs consumed the endowment income. The institution relied on donations, admission fees, and shrewd financial management to survive. Few families could match Frick's foresight or resources. Most estates entered probate after the owner's death. Heirs faced estate tax bills exceeding 40% of the property's value. To pay the taxes, they sold the mansion. The buyers were always developers. The outcome was always demolition. The battle became particularly intense in Chicago. Potter Palmer, a real estate magnate, built a castle on Lakeshore Drive in 1882. The mansion contained 90 rooms and cost $1 million, equivalent to $35 million today. When Palmer died in 1902, his widow maintained the property. When she died in 1918, the children inherited. By 1930, they could not afford the upkeep. They sold to developers in 1940. The family negotiated preservation of certain rooms in the Art Institute of Chicago. Everything else was demolished. An apartment building replaced the mansion in 1950. In San Francisco, the James Flood Mansion on Nob Hill survived the 1906 earthquake when nearly every other mansion burned. Constructed from Connecticut brownstone, the building proved fireproof. After the earthquake, Flood's widow could not afford to maintain the property. She sold it to the Pacific Union Club, a private men's club, in 1907. The club renovated the interior and expanded the building. They had the financial resources to maintain the property because hundreds of wealthy members shared the cost. This model, converting mansions into private clubs, saved several dozen buildings nationwide. But it worked only for properties in desirable locations that could attract sufficient membership. The battle lines were clear. On one side stood preservationists, historians, and families who viewed these mansions as cultural assets worth saving. On the other side stood developers, city planners, and politicians who viewed them as obstacles to progress. The preservationists lost nearly every battle. They lacked money, legal authority, and political power. The developers had all three, but the preservationists learned. Each lost battle taught lessons. They began lobbying for historic preservation laws. They pressured politicians to create landmark protections. They organized public campaigns to raise awareness. And slowly, painfully, they began to change the legal framework governing demolition. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 created the National Register of Historic Places. Buildings listed on the register received protection from federally funded demolition. But the act contained a fatal weakness. It only applied to federal projects. Private owners could still demolish registered landmarks without consequence. New York City passed the Landmarks Preservation Law in 1965, after Pennsylvania Station's demolition sparked outrage. The law allowed the city to designate buildings as landmarks and prohibit demolition without approval. But the law came too late. By 1965, most of the great Gilded Age mansions were already gone. The battle for land and legacy continued through the 1970s and 80s. Some mansions survived through conversion to museums, schools, or institutional use. Others were saved when preservation organizations purchased them, but most were demolished. By 1980, fewer than 200 of the original 2,000 Gilded Age mansions remained. The battle was over. The developers had won. What remained were fragments. Architectural elements salvaged from demolished buildings found their way into museums. Photographs documented what existed. Historical societies collected documentation. But the buildings themselves, the physical manifestations of an entire era, were gone. The question that haunted every preservationist was simple. Could anything have stopped this destruction? Or was it inevitable that progress would erase beauty, that economics would overwhelm sentiment, that the future would devour the past? The hidden forces of the demolition boom. As wealthy estates disappeared, new forces fueled an unprecedented wave of destruction, forces that went far beyond what was visible on the surface. The real estate lobby shaped policy with surgical precision. Between 1930 and 1960, developer associations poured millions into political campaigns. They hired former city officials as consultants. They drafted legislation that state governments passed with minimal modification. They created a legal environment where demolition became the default option and preservation the exception. Their strategy was sophisticated. Rather than directly attacking historic buildings, they promoted policies that made preservation financially impossible. Accelerated depreciation schedules favored new construction. Tax abatements rewarded demolition and redevelopment. Zoning changes prohibited residential use in commercial districts. Each policy appeared reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a machine that systematically eliminated older buildings. The Federal Housing Administration played an unexpected role. Created in 1934 to stimulate housing construction, the FHA refused to insure mortgages in neighborhoods it deemed high risk. Their maps, outlined in red ink, identified areas ineligible for federal backing. These red-lined zones frequently included neighborhoods with older mansions. Without FHA insurance, banks would not lend. Without lending, buyers could not purchase. Without buyers, property values collapsed. Redlining became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Neighborhoods denied investment deteriorated. Deterioration justified the original redlining designation. The cycle continued until demolition became inevitable, but redlining was racially motivated as well. The FHA explicitly considered racial composition when assessing neighborhoods. Areas with even small minority populations received lower ratings. Many Gilded Age mansions stood in neighborhoods that became increasingly diverse through the 1930s and 40s. As demographics shifted, FHA ratings dropped. Property values declined, families fled, mansions emptied. The phenomenon became known as white flight. Wealthy families abandoned urban mansions for suburban homes. The abandoned mansions could not attract buyers. They deteriorated. Eventually, they were demolished for redevelopment or public housing. Political corruption accelerated destruction. City officials approved demolition permits in exchange for campaign contributions. Building inspectors condemned structurally sound buildings because developers paid them to. Zoning boards granted variances that favored demolition. The corruption was rarely prosecuted and widely understood. In some cases, developers burned buildings they wanted to demolish. Arson eliminated the structure and made the insurance payout exceed the acquisition cost. Investigations proved difficult. Evidence burned with the building. Witnesses disappeared. Perpetrators were rarely caught. The insurance industry contributed to the destruction. They classified older buildings as high risk and charged premiums that exceeded the property's rental income. Owners could not afford coverage. Without insurance, banks foreclosed. The foreclosed properties entered bank portfolios. Banks sold them to developers. Developers demolished. Labor unions inadvertently assisted demolition. Through the 1950s and 60s, construction unions negotiated higher wages and benefits. Renovation costs soared because restoration required skilled craftsmen who commanded premium pay. New construction, performed by less skilled workers using modern techniques, cost less. Developers chose demolition and new construction over renovation. Environmental regulations, intended to protect public health, made preserving older buildings more expensive. Lead paint abatement, asbestos removal, and upgrading electrical systems to modern codes added costs that frequently exceeded a building's market value. Owners faced an impossible choice: invest more than the property was worth or demolish. The Federal Highway Program, launched in 1956, demolished more mansions than any other single policy. The interstate highway system required thousands of miles of new roads through existing cities. Planners chose routes through older neighborhoods where land acquisition costs were lowest. Gilded Age. Mansions, often located near city centers, stood in the path. Highway construction destroyed entire neighborhoods. In Detroit, the Lodge Freeway demolished dozens of mansions along Woodward Avenue. In Los Angeles, the Harbor Freeway cut through West Adams, demolishing Victorian and Edwardian estates. In Boston, the Central Artery destroyed the West End neighborhood, eliminating dozens of historic buildings. Cultural institutions that should have opposed demolition remained silent or actively participated. Universities expanded campuses by purchasing and demolishing nearby mansions. Churches sold their properties to developers. Historical societies focused on saving individual objects rather than entire buildings. The academic profession contributed to the problem. Architecture schools taught modernist principles that rejected historical styles. Students learned that ornamentation was dishonest, that form should follow function, that the past should not constrain the future. These students became practicing architects who designed buildings that replaced demolished mansions. They felt no guilt. They believed they were improving cities. Newspaper coverage shifted from celebration to condemnation. In 1880, papers published detailed descriptions of new mansions, complete with illustrations. By 1940, similar coverage highlighted waste and excess. Public opinion turned against visible wealth. Families who might have fought to save their mansions chose to avoid publicity instead. The Cold War introduced new pressures. American politicians wanted to distinguish the country from Soviet communism. visible economic inequality became a propaganda liability. Demolishing mansions that symbolized wealth concentration became patriotic. Urban renewal that replaced estates with public housing demonstrated American commitment to social equality. This ideological shift was profound. The same buildings that represented American achievement in 1880 symbolized American failure in 1950. The mansions did not change. The interpretation did. Financial institutions developed new tools that accelerated demolition. Real estate investment trusts, created in 1960, allowed investors to pool capital for property acquisition. REITs purchased mansions, demolished them, and developed the land. The investors never saw the buildings. They were numbers on balance sheets. Sentiment played no role. The tax code created perverse incentives. Buildings could be depreciated to zero value over 27.5 years. After depreciation, selling the property triggered capital gains taxes. Demolishing and redeveloping allowed owners to start a new depreciation schedule and defer taxes indefinitely. The code rewarded destruction. By 1960, the hidden forces had created an industrial demolition complex. Developers identified targets. Banks financed acquisitions. City governments approved permits. Construction crews demolished buildings, and new structures rose on the sites. The process repeated thousands of times. Nobody planned this outcome. No single policy created it. Instead, dozens of policies, hundreds of decisions, and thousands of individual actions combined to produce a systematic erasure of architectural history. The machine operated efficiently. It destroyed beauty and replaced it with functionality. It erased memory and created progress. And once it started, nobody could stop it. When the numbers stopped making sense, financial logic, once a bulwark for preservation, turned against these grand homes in ways that are still difficult to understand today. The numbers tell the story of how economics destroyed what beauty could not save. In 1890, the Vanderbilt family spent $11 million constructing the mansion at 5th Avenue and 57th Street. The building cost approximately $385 million in today's currency. The land cost $1 million, about $35 million today. Total investment, $420 million. By 1920, property taxes on that land exceeded $200,000 annually, approximately $3 million today. Maintenance employed 40 full-time staff at a cost of $150,000 per year, equivalent to $2.5 million today. Utilities, repairs, insurance, and other expenses added another $100,000, roughly $1.5 million today. Total annual operating cost, $7 million in modern currency. The family earned no income from the property. It was purely residential. To maintain the mansion, the family needed to generate $7 million annually from other investments. At a 5% return, that required $140 million in invested capital just to cover mansion operating costs. And this assumed no extraordinary expenses like roof replacement, facade cleaning, or structural repairs. The math became impossible when estate taxes were factored in. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II died in 1899, his estate paid minimal taxes. When his widow died in 1904, taxes consumed a small percentage. But by 1940, federal estate taxes peaked at 77%. If the mansion and land were valued at $20 million in 1940, approximately $400 million today, the estate tax bill would exceed $15 million, roughly $300 million in modern terms. To pay that bill, heirs had to liquidate assets. Selling the mansion generated some revenue, But selling a property nobody wanted for residential use meant selling below assessed value. The only buyers were developers who valued land, not buildings. They offered prices based on redevelopment potential. If the land could support a commercial building generating $3 million annually in rent and commercial property sold at a 6% capitalization rate, the land was worth $50 million. But only if the mansion was demolished. With the mansion standing, the property might sell for $5 million. Demolished, it was worth $50 million. The difference, $45 million, represented the value destroyed by the building's existence. This created an absurd situation. The most expensive house in America, which cost the equivalent of $420 million to construct, reduced property value by $45 million by continuing to exist. The building itself had negative value. This pattern repeated across every major city. In Chicago, the Palmer Castle on Lakeshore Drive cost $1 million to build in 1882, roughly $35 million today. By 1940, the land was worth $8 million, but only $2 million with the castle standing. The building destroyed $6 million in value. Property taxes compounded the problem. Cities assessed property based on its highest and best use. For land in commercial districts, that meant commercial development. Even though the property housed a mansion, taxes were calculated as though an office building stood there. Owners paid commercial property tax rates on residential buildings. The mismatch was crushing. A mansion generating no income paid taxes as though it generated $3 million annually. Owners lost money every year the building stood. Insurance presented another impossible equation. By 1950, insuring a large mansion cost 5 to 10% of its value annually. A $20 million mansion required $1 to $2 million in annual insurance premiums. This was purely an operating cost with no return. Banks recognized the math and stopped lending. If someone wanted to purchase a mansion, banks refused to provide mortgages. The properties could not generate income sufficient to service debt. Without financing, the market for mansions collapsed. Families tried converting mansions to commercial use. Most attempts failed quickly. Hotels required guest room sizes that mansion room layouts could not accommodate. Offices needed open floor plans that load-bearing walls prevented. Restaurants needed commercial kitchens and fire suppression systems that cost millions to install. A few successful conversions occurred. The Henry Clay Frick Mansion became a museum. Several mansions became private clubs. But these succeeded only with enormous subsidies or wealthy members willing to accept financial losses. The tax code made renovation economically irrational. If a building needed $2 million in repairs, the owner could deduct depreciation on the building's existing value, but gained no tax benefit from the renovation. The improved building was assessed at higher value, increasing property taxes. The math punished preservation and rewarded abandonment. Demolition costs were tax deductible. If demolishing a building cost $500,000, owners could deduct the expense. Selling the vacant land generated capital gains taxed at preferential rates. The tax code incentivized destruction. By 1950, the financial logic was inescapable. Maintaining a Gilded Age mansion cost millions annually. The property generated no income. Taxes consumed capital. Insurance drained resources. Renovation increased costs. And the building itself reduced land value. The only economically rational decision was demolition. Sell the land, pay the capital gains taxes, invest the proceeds, and generate passive income. Every financial advisor recommended this course. Every accountant confirmed the numbers. Every banker agreed. But the numbers alone do not explain why families made these decisions. Many could afford the losses. The Vanderbilts, despite diminished fortunes, retained substantial wealth through 1950. They could have maintained the Fifth Avenue mansion at a loss. They chose not to. Why? The answer reveals something deeper than economics. The families no longer believed the mansions were worth saving. They no longer identified with the buildings. They no longer saw them as family seats, but as burdens. The emotional attachment that once made financial sacrifice acceptable had dissolved. When the first generation built these mansions, they were creating dynasty. The buildings represented immortality through architecture. The founders believed their names would echo through centuries because the physical structures would endure. The third generation saw things differently. They viewed the mansions as monuments to ancestors they never knew. The buildings felt like museums of someone else's life. Maintaining them felt like curating a past that no longer mattered. So when the numbers stopped making sense, when accountants showed that keeping the mansion destroyed wealth, when lawyers advised that demolition was prudent, the families agreed. They signed the papers, they accepted the offers, and they watched bulldozers reduce their family history to rubble without looking back. The financial logic of demolition was real. But the emotional logic of abandonment was what ultimately sealed the fate of these buildings. When families stopped caring, no amount of money could save the mansions, and America lost not just buildings, but an entire way of life. The bulldozer's wake. It wasn't just the buildings that were destroyed. Lives, histories, and entire legacies were torn apart in a matter of hours. Margaret Vanderbilt watched from across the street as the wrecking crew attacked her childhood home. It was March 1954. She had not lived in the mansion for 30 years. The family sold the property in 1948. She knew demolition was coming. But watching the actual destruction felt different than imagining it. The wreckers started with the roof. They cut through slate tiles that had lasted 70 years without leaking. Each tile crashed to the ground and shattered. The sound echoed across Fifth Avenue. Pedestrians stopped to watch. Margaret stood on the sidewalk, her face expressionless, while strangers photographed the destruction. The crew reached the top floor bedrooms next. These were the rooms where she had grown up, where she learned to walk, where her mother read her stories before bed. The wreckers swung sledgehammers into plaster walls. The walls collapsed into clouds of white dust. Within hours, the rooms ceased to exist. By the second day, they reached the main hall. This was the space where her parents hosted balls for 500 guests, where President Theodore Roosevelt attended dinner, where her father announced his daughter's engagement to European nobility. The carved wooden panels, imported from France and installed by master craftsmen, were torn from the walls and thrown into dump trucks. Nobody wanted them. The wood was too ornate for modern tastes. The panels were too large for standard rooms. Museums had already taken what they wanted. The rest became trash. Margaret never returned to watch again, but she read newspaper accounts. The demolition took 6 weeks. The mansion that took 3 years to build was erased in a month and a half. Similar scenes played out across America. In Newport, Alice Brayton watched demolition crews destroy Beacon Rock, her family's summer cottage. The house had been in the family for 60 years. She had married there. Her children were born there. The family could not afford the upkeep and sold to developers in 1956. The developers initially planned to subdivide the property and preserve the house. They discovered the costs were prohibitive. They demolished instead. Alice received a letter informing her of the decision. She had no legal recourse. The developers owned the property. She drove to Newport to retrieve personal items before demolition. The house was empty. Vandals had broken in. Graffiti covered the walls. Copper plumbing had been stolen. The gardens were overgrown. The house she remembered existed only in memory. But the emotional toll extended beyond families. Entire communities lost their identity when mansions disappeared. In Chicago, the South Side defined itself by the mansions along Prairie Avenue. Between 1870 and 1900, this was the wealthiest street in America. George Pullman, Marshall Field, Philip Armour, and dozens of other industrial magnates built homes there. The street was called the Millionaire's Row. By 1950, the neighborhood had changed. Industry encroached. Warehouses replaced homes. Wealthy families fled to suburbs. The mansions that remained housed multiple families, boarding houses, or stood empty. City planners decided the neighborhood needed urban renewal. They rezoned for industrial use. They condemned remaining mansions. Between 1950 and 1965, every mansion on Prairie Avenue was demolished except two. The Glessner House and the Clark House survived only because they were already museums. The demolitions destroyed more than buildings. They erased the community's history and identity. The neighborhood lost the landmarks that gave it character. Without the mansions, Prairie Avenue became indistinguishable from any other industrial corridor. The sense of place disappeared. Workers who maintained these mansions lost livelihoods. A large estate employed 40 to 60 people: cooks, housekeepers, gardeners, drivers, and maintenance staff. When the mansion was demolished, all lost their jobs simultaneously. For some, these were multi-generational positions. A family might have 3 generations working in the same household. The butler's son became a footman. The gardener's daughter worked in the kitchen. When the estate sold, these family employment networks collapsed. The workers had limited options. Few possessed skills transferable to other employment. Butlers could not easily become factory workers. Gardeners could not transition to office jobs. Many fell into poverty after losing positions they had held for decades. Craftsmen who maintained architectural details faced particular hardship. Stone carvers who spent careers repairing mansion facades found no demand for their skills. Plasterers who created ornamental ceiling work could not find employment. The demolition boom destroyed not just buildings but entire professions. Museums salvaged what they could, but preservation was selective. They wanted furniture, paintings, and decorative objects. They rarely wanted architectural elements. A carved stone fireplace might weigh 10 tons. Moving it required specialized equipment, and installation demanded structural engineering. Museums lacked resources for such preservation. So priceless architectural details went to landfills. Hand-carved marble staircases were crushed into rubble. Stained glass windows designed by Tiffany were shattered. Bronze doors cast by renowned sculptors were melted for scrap value. The objects were destroyed because preserving them cost more than their perceived value. The psychological impact extended to entire cities. Urban residents watched their physical environment transform within a generation. The built landscape that defined their childhood disappeared. Landmarks that oriented them vanished. The city became unrecognizable. This created a sense of dislocation. If the physical world could change so completely, what else might disappear? The destruction of mansions symbolized broader instability. Nothing was permanent. Everything was subject to economic calculation and rational demolition. Some demolitions became public spectacles. When the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion was demolished in 1927, newspapers covered the event extensively. Photographers documented each day's progress. The images were printed in papers nationwide. Americans watched the destruction unfold, photo by photo. The coverage treated demolition as inevitable progress. Captions emphasized the modern building that would replace the outdated mansion. The narrative was celebration, not mourning. But readers who had visited the mansion or remembered its grandeur experienced the coverage differently. They saw cultural loss disguised as improvement. Children who grew up near these mansions lost landmarks that defined their neighborhoods. The mansion on the corner where they passed walking to school. The grand house with the interesting gate where they paused during bike rides. These personal landmarks shaped memory and identity. When demolished, they left absence. Years later, adults would try to describe these mansions to their children, but words failed. Photographs helped, but could not convey scale or atmosphere. The experience of encountering these buildings in person, of understanding their size and grandeur through direct observation, could not be transmitted. The buildings were gone, and the experience of them disappeared as well. The demolition boom created a generation that grew up surrounded by absence. Older residents remembered what stood on empty lots. Younger people saw only parking structures and office buildings. The two groups inhabited different cities, occupying the same physical space. This disconnect between remembered landscape and actual landscape created nostalgia. The past became idealized because it existed only in memory. The mansions, imperfect buildings maintained by exploited labor and financed by questionable means, became symbols of lost beauty and destroyed grandeur. The emotional reality was more complex. These were complicated structures with troubled histories, but their destruction was so complete and so rapid that nuanced assessment became impossible. They were gone before anyone could properly document or understand them. And in the bulldozer's wake came a question nobody could answer. Could anything justify this destruction? Or had America committed an act of cultural vandalism it would regret for generations? A desperate fight for preservation. Amid the wreckage, a handful of visionaries fought to save what was left of America's architectural soul. Henry Francis DuPont understood what was being lost. An heir to the DuPont chemical fortune, he watched mansion after mansion demolished through the 1930s and 40s. Unlike most wealthy Americans, he believed preservation mattered more than progress. In 1951, DuPont opened Winterthur Museum in Delaware. The mansion, built by his family, contained 175 rooms displaying American decorative arts. But DuPont did more than create a museum. He established a preservation philosophy. He argued that architecture embodied cultural memory. Buildings were not just structures, but documents that taught future generations about their past. Destroying them was destroying knowledge. Each demolished mansion erased evidence of how people lived, worked, and organized society. This philosophy found few adherents initially, but DuPont persisted. He funded preservation organizations. He purchased endangered buildings. He trained craftsmen in historical restoration techniques. He created programs teaching architectural history, and gradually, he built a preservation movement. The movement faced enormous obstacles. Money was the first challenge. Preserving a single mansion required millions. Most preservation organizations operated on budgets of thousands. They could save individual rooms, but not entire buildings. Legal authority was the second challenge. Before 1965, few cities had landmark protection laws. Property owners could demolish any building they owned. Preservation organizations could protest, but lacked legal standing to prevent demolition. Public support was the third challenge. Most Americans believed demolition represented progress. They viewed preservationists as nostalgic elites trying to preserve privilege. Getting middle-class Americans to care about saving millionaire mansions proved nearly impossible. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, founded in 1949, attempted systematic preservation. They created the first national inventory of endangered buildings. They lobbied for protective legislation. They provided technical assistance to local preservation groups. But their resources were minuscule compared to the scale of destruction. Between 1950 and 1965, the National Trust saved fewer than 20 Gilded Age mansions nationwide. During the same period, over 800 were demolished. The organization was fighting a losing battle, but individual victories inspired continued effort. In 1960, preservationists saved Lyndhurst, a Gothic revival mansion in Tarrytown, New York. The owner died and left the property to the National Trust. The organization renovated the building and opened it as a museum. The success demonstrated that preservation was possible. Similar victories occurred in Newport. The Preservation Society of Newport County, founded in 1945, began acquiring endangered mansions. They opened the Elms in 1962. Chateau-sur-Mer followed in 1969. Slowly, they assembled a collection of preserved estates. But for every success, 10 mansions were lost. The preservationists learned painful lessons. They realized timing was critical. Once a demolition permit was issued, stopping destruction became nearly impossible. They needed to intervene earlier, before owners decided to sell. They also learned that preservation required ongoing financial commitment. Saving a building was not enough. Maintaining it demanded endowments generating sufficient income to cover operating costs. Without endowments, saved buildings became future demolitions. The preservation movement developed new strategies. They encouraged adaptive reuse, convert mansions to offices, schools, or community centers, make them functional rather than purely historical, generate income to cover costs. Some adaptive reuse succeeded spectacularly. The Cooper Hewitt Museum occupied the Andrew Carnegie Mansion on Fifth Avenue. The building functioned as a museum while preserving its residential character. The Frick Collection performed a similar transformation of Henry Clay Frick's home. But most adaptive reuse attempts failed. Buildings designed as private residences rarely functioned well as public institutions. Rooms were too small. Circulation was inefficient. Modern code compliance required expensive renovations. Many attempts at adaptive reuse ended in demolition anyway. The preservationists also discovered public relations mattered enormously. They needed to change how Americans viewed these buildings. If mansions were symbols of inequality, preservation seemed like protecting privilege. But if they were artistic masterpieces, preservation became cultural conservation. The movement reframed the narrative. They emphasized craftsmanship over wealth. They highlighted architectural innovation over family history. They argued these buildings represented American achievement, not American excess. The reframing worked gradually. The destruction of Pennsylvania Station in 1963 became a turning point. The station, designed by McKim, Mead, and White, was one of America's greatest Beaux Arts buildings. When demolition was announced, preservationists organized unprecedented protests. Newspaper editorials condemned the decision. Architecture critics called it vandalism. Picketers surrounded the building. Celebrities joined the protests. For the first time, preservation became a public issue that mainstream Americans cared about. The protests failed to save Penn Station. Demolition proceeded in 1963. But the public outcry changed the political landscape. Within 2 years, New York passed the Landmarks Preservation Law. Cities nationwide followed with similar legislation. The new laws gave preservation organizations legal tools. Buildings could be designated landmarks. Designation required owners to seek approval before making exterior changes. Demolition could be prevented or delayed. The movement finally had power to match their passion. But the laws came too late to save most Gilded Age mansions. By 1965, fewer than 300 remained of the original 2,000. The vast majority were already gone. The legal protection was like arriving at a fire after the building had burned. The preservationists shifted strategy again. They focused on preventing future losses rather than reversing past destruction. They created educational programs. They trained architects in restoration techniques. They documented remaining buildings extensively. They built the infrastructure for a preservation culture. Young architects trained in the 1970s and 80s embraced preservation. Unlike their predecessors, who viewed historical buildings as obstacles, this generation saw them as assets. They developed restoration practices. They learned historical construction techniques. They advocated for preservation in professional organizations. The movement also discovered that preserved mansions could generate economic value. Tourism to house museums created jobs. Restoration projects employed craftsmen. Historic districts attracted affluent residents. Preservation became economically defensible. By 1980, the preservation movement had matured. They had legal tools, public support, professional expertise, and economic arguments. But they also had regret. So much had been lost that could never be recovered. Henry Francis Dupont died in 1969. He spent his final years watching preservation gain momentum. But he also watched demolitions continue. In his last interview, he was asked if his efforts had succeeded. He answered carefully. The movement had saved some buildings. They had changed laws. They had altered how Americans thought about architectural heritage. But measured against what was lost, the victories seemed small. He said, "We saved a few dozen buildings. We lost 2,000. I am not sure that qualifies as success." The irony of progress. In the name of progress, America destroyed its own architectural history, replacing beauty with the sterile uniformity of modern urbanism. The irony became visible in the 1970s. Cities that demolished mansions to modernize discovered they had destroyed exactly what made them distinctive. Fifth Avenue in New York offered the most dramatic example. Between 1880 and 1910, the avenue between 50th and 96th Streets contained over 200 mansions. Each was unique. Architectural styles ranged from Gothic Revival to Beaux Arts to Italian Renaissance. The street was an outdoor museum of American architectural ambition. By 1970, fewer than 10 mansions remained. The rest had been replaced by apartment towers, office buildings, and commercial structures. The new buildings were functional and profitable, but they were also interchangeable. The architectural diversity that made Fifth Avenue distinctive had been erased. Tourists who visited New York expected to see grand mansions they had read about in novels and seen in photographs. Instead, they found glass towers indistinguishable from office buildings in any American city. The expectation of grandeur met the reality of sterile modernism. city planners began to realize their mistake. The demolished mansions had been more than residential buildings. They were tourist attractions. They contributed to the city's identity. They gave neighborhoods character and history. Replacing them with generic structures had diminished what made New York unique. But the realization came too late. The buildings were gone. The craftsmanship could not be replicated. The land had been redeveloped. Restoration was impossible. Chicago experienced similar regret. Prairie Avenue, once the most prestigious street in America, became an industrial corridor after mansions were demolished. The city hoped industry would generate tax revenue and employment. But the factories never materialized at projected levels. The area became blighted. By 1980, Prairie Avenue was a cautionary tale. Urban planners studied it as an example of misguided renewal. They concluded that preserving historic buildings would have been more economically valuable than demolishing them for industrial development that never happened. San Francisco provided a different irony. The city demolished Victorian mansions after the 1906 earthquake. The decision made sense at the time. The buildings were damaged. Modern construction seemed safer. Progress demanded new structures. But by 1970, San Francisco recognized that Victorian architecture defined the city's visual identity. Tourists came specifically to see Victorian homes. The city began strict preservation of remaining examples. Property values in Victorian neighborhoods exceeded those in areas with modern construction. The lesson was clear. The outdated architecture that planners demolished in the name of progress had become precisely what made cities valuable and distinctive. Progress had destroyed what people wanted. The replacement buildings embodied modernist principles. Form followed function. Ornamentation was eliminated. Historical references were rejected. The buildings were rational, efficient, and profitable. But they were also boring. Nobody traveled to see a glass office tower. No photographer framed shots around a parking garage. No novelist set romantic scenes in a sterile apartment lobby. The modern buildings that replaced demolished mansions generated no emotional response. Urban theorists began questioning whether modernist architecture had been a mistake. Jane Jacobs published The Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1961. She argued that successful cities needed diversity, history, and human-scale architecture. Modernist planning, with its emphasis on demolition and standardization, destroyed exactly what made cities livable. Jacobs became the intellectual leader of a movement questioning post-war urban planning. Her ideas gained traction through the 1970s. City planners began emphasizing preservation over demolition. Historic districts were created. Adaptive reuse was encouraged. The assumptions that justified mansion demolition were systematically discredited. But this intellectual shift could not undo physical destruction. The mansions were gone. Photographs documented what existed. Architectural histories described them. But experiencing the buildings in person, walking through their rooms, seeing how light entered through stained glass windows, feeling the scale of their spaces, none of this was possible. Museums attempted to reconstruct lost interiors. The Metropolitan Museum of Art installed entire rooms from demolished mansions. Visitors could see the craftsmanship. But the rooms existed in isolation, removed from their original context. The experience was educational, but not authentic. The period rooms revealed what had been lost. Each demonstrated a level of craftsmanship that no longer existed. The artisans who created these interiors possessed skills that were no longer taught. The industries that supported this work had disappeared. Even with unlimited budgets, recreating these interiors was impossible. This realization prompted new appreciation for remaining mansions. Properties that seemed burdensome in 1950 appeared precious by 1980. Cities that had demolished aggressively began strict preservation. The cultural pendulum swung from demolition to protection. But protection created new ironies. Landmark designation prevented demolition, but did not provide maintenance funding. Owners were required to preserve buildings, but received no financial assistance to do so. Many owners felt punished for owning historic properties. The economic calculations that made demolition rational in 1950 remained in 1980. Property taxes still exceeded income. Maintenance costs still drained capital. Insurance remained expensive. But now owners could not demolish. They were trapped maintaining buildings they could not afford. Some owners deliberately allowed properties to deteriorate. If a building decayed sufficiently, landmark protection could be removed. The strategy became known as demolition by neglect. Preservation organizations fought it through litigation and public pressure. But stopping neglect proved nearly impossible. The preservation movement faced a paradox. They had gained legal tools to prevent demolition, but lacked economic tools to make preservation sustainable. They could force owners to maintain buildings, but could not force them to do so well. This paradox revealed the fundamental problem. America's economic system valued new construction over preservation. Tax codes favored development. Financial returns rewarded demolition. Market forces pushed toward replacement. Fighting these forces required constant effort and expenditure. By 2000, the irony was complete. Cities recognized that demolished mansions had been valuable. They passed laws protecting remaining buildings. They created programs supporting preservation. But they could not acknowledge that the economic system remained fundamentally opposed to preservation. The modern buildings that replaced mansions were aging. Many were approaching demolition themselves. Would they be preserved? Or would they suffer the same fate as the buildings they replaced? The question remained unanswered. But one thing was certain. America had destroyed irreplaceable beauty in pursuit of progress. And the progress achieved was far less valuable than what had been sacrificed. What was lost forever. With each bulldozer's roar, America erased not just buildings, but a way of life that could never be replicated. The loss was physical first. 2,000 mansions represented approximately 200 million square feet of interior space. That equals roughly 4,600 acres of floor area. Every inch was crafted by hand. Every surface bore the mark of human skill. Consider what this meant in practical terms. Master stone carvers spent years shaping marble for staircases. Each baluster was unique. Each newel post featured original designs. No two staircases were identical. When the buildings were demolished, this carved stone became rubble. Centuries of skill were reduced to landfill. Wood carving represented similar loss. Paneling in a single room might contain 10,000 individual carved elements. Creating this work required years. A master carver might spend 6 months on one fireplace surround. When demolished, the wood was burned or dumped. The months of skilled labor vanished in minutes. Stained. Glass presented particular tragedy. American artists created original windows for these mansions. The glass was hand-blown. Colors were mixed to specification. Images were designed specifically for their location. Each window was a unique artwork. When demolished, the windows shattered. The art was destroyed permanently. Plasterwork suffered similar fate. Ornamental ceilings required months to create. Craftsmen applied layers of plaster, carved details while the material remained workable, and finished surfaces to mirror smoothness. A single ceiling might contain 50 individual medallions, each different. All were destroyed when buildings came down, but the physical loss extended beyond craftsmanship. The materials themselves were irreplaceable. Marble came from quarries that had since closed. Specific varieties of stone, chosen for color and grain, were no longer available. Wood came from old-growth forests that no longer existed. The materials used in these mansions literally could not be sourced again. This created a permanent loss. Even if someone wanted to recreate a demolished mansion, they could not obtain the materials. The marble was unavailable. The wood was extinct. The techniques were forgotten. Reconstruction was impossible. The cultural loss exceeded the physical. These mansions embodied social practices that disappeared with the buildings. The way wealthy families lived in these spaces, how they used the rooms, how they moved through the house, all represented a distinct culture. Formal calling hours, elaborate dinner parties with 12 courses, weekend house parties lasting 3 days. These social rituals required specific spaces. When the spaces disappeared, the practices ended. Later generations read about these customs, but could not experience them. The servants' culture vanished as well. Below stairs, life in these mansions created its own social hierarchy and practices. Butlers, housekeepers, cooks, maids, footmen, and stable hands formed communities. They had customs, traditions, and social rules. This entire subculture existed within and because of these buildings. When the mansions were demolished, the servants' culture dissolved. The younger generation moved to different employment. The knowledge and practices were not transmitted. Within a single generation, this entire way of life became history. The architectural knowledge loss was catastrophic. These buildings incorporated engineering solutions to problems that are still relevant. How to heat 100 rooms efficiently. How to ventilate large spaces before air conditioning. How to create natural lighting in deep interior rooms. The solutions were sophisticated and effective, but the buildings were demolished before architects studied them systematically. The knowledge existed in physical form, but was never documented. When the structures fell, the knowledge vanished. Modern architects attempting similar challenges must rediscover solutions that were already known and then forgotten. The gardens represented another layer of loss. These estates featured formal gardens designed by the country's leading landscape architects. Frederick Law Olmsted designed grounds for multiple mansions. The gardens were as carefully crafted as the buildings. They took decades to mature. When estates were demolished, gardens were destroyed immediately. Mature trees that took 50 years to reach size were cut down. Formal plantings were bulldozed. Statuary was sold or discarded. The landscape that gave context to the architecture disappeared faster than the buildings themselves. Family archives were dispersed. Letters, photographs, journals, account books, and documents that would illuminate how these households functioned were scattered. Some went to libraries, most were discarded. The documentary record that would allow detailed understanding of these places was largely destroyed. The loss extended to urban fabric. These mansions defined neighborhoods. They established scale. They created visual landmarks. They gave districts identity. When demolished, neighborhoods lost character. The specific sense of place that made each area distinctive evaporated. Streets that were internationally famous became ordinary. Fifth Avenue, once synonymous with American grandeur, became a shopping corridor. Prairie Avenue, Millionaire's Row, became an industrial zone. Nob Hill in San Francisco, razed by earthquake and never fully rebuilt, became commercial towers. The geographic locations remained, but the character vanished. The economic loss was substantial, but difficult to calculate. Tourism revenues that might have been generated were lost. Jobs that might have been created did not materialize. Educational opportunities that might have existed disappeared. The buildings had economic value beyond their real estate value, but this was not recognized until after they were demolished. American identity suffered a loss that is still being calculated. These mansions represented the country's Gilded Age, a period when America claimed global leadership. The buildings were physical evidence of American achievement. They demonstrated that the country could match European grandeur and exceed it. By demolishing these buildings, America erased evidence of its own historical achievement. Future generations could read about the Gilded Age, but could not see its monuments. The physical proof of what America had accomplished was destroyed. This created a discontinuity in national memory. The 20th century began with architectural masterpieces across the country. By mid-century, they were mostly gone. The physical landscape that shaped earlier generations' understanding of their country had been erased and replaced. What remains are fragments, a few dozen preserved mansions out of 2,000, photographs documenting what existed, museum collections of objects removed from demolished buildings, architectural histories describing what was lost. These fragments hint at what existed but cannot recreate it. The loss is permanent. The buildings cannot be rebuilt. The craftsmanship cannot be replicated. The culture cannot be restored. The knowledge cannot be recovered. What was destroyed is gone forever. And America will never know the full extent of what it lost, because the loss happened so quickly and so completely that documentation was incomplete. We know what major mansions existed. We have limited information about smaller estates. We have almost no information about regional mansions outside major cities. The demolition boom erased an architectural legacy so thoroughly that historians cannot even reconstruct a complete inventory of what existed. The loss exceeds what can be measured because we can no longer measure what was lost. A new identity. The demolition of these mansions was more than the destruction of buildings. It was a symbolic severance from a past America could no longer embrace. By 1960, America had become a fundamentally different country than it was in 1900. The values that justified building grand mansions had been replaced by values that demanded their destruction. The Gilded Age celebrated individual achievement. Fortunes were personal accomplishments. Mansions were monuments to self-made men who transformed industries and created wealth. The country admired these figures. They were heroes who embodied American possibility. The New Deal era rejected this celebration. Wealth concentration became a social problem. Government policy aimed to redistribute resources. Progressive taxation ensured that Gilded Age fortunes could not be replicated. The self-made man became a figure of suspicion rather than admiration. This shift in values made the mansions ideologically problematic. They symbolized everything mid-century America rejected: excessive inequality, hereditary wealth, conspicuous consumption. Preserving them seemed like endorsing the values they represented. Demolition became a statement. By destroying these buildings, America declared it had moved beyond the Gilded Age. The country embraced democracy, equality, and shared prosperity. The old world of inherited privilege was literally being torn down. But this symbolic destruction carried unintended consequences. America lost connection to its own history. The physical monuments that would have reminded future generations where the country came from disappeared. The continuity between past and present was broken. Younger generations growing up after 1960 had no direct experience of these buildings. They knew them only through photographs and descriptions. The mansions became abstract rather than concrete. They were historical curiosities rather than physical reality. This created a peculiar relationship to the past. Americans could read about the Gilded Age, but could not see it. The period became myth rather than history. Without physical evidence, the era seemed more distant than chronology suggested. The replacement buildings embodied different values. Modern office towers celebrated corporate efficiency. Apartment buildings emphasized density and accessibility. Shopping centers democratized consumption. Each new structure announced that America had moved forward. But moving forward required moving away from something. The demolished mansions were what America moved away from. They became symbols of a rejected past. Preserving them would have meant maintaining connection to values the country had abandoned. This explains why preservation efforts gained little traction before 1960. Saving these buildings would have contradicted the national narrative. America was building a new society. The old society's monuments needed to disappear for the new society to feel authentic. The Cultural Revolution of the 1960s accelerated this rejection. Young people questioned authority, tradition, and inherited privilege. The mansions represented everything the counterculture opposed: hierarchy, formality, and social stratification. Demolishing them aligned with revolutionary values. But by the 1970s, the narrative shifted again. Americans began recognizing that rejecting the past entirely meant losing connection to history. Historic preservation movements gained momentum. People wanted to maintain links to earlier eras, even if they rejected those eras' values. This created tension. How could America preserve Gilded Age mansions without endorsing Gilded Age values? The solution was reframing. The buildings were presented as art rather than symbols of wealth. They were architectural achievements rather than monuments to inequality. The narrative emphasized craftsmanship over class. This reframing allowed preservation without ideological compromise. Americans could appreciate the buildings as artistic objects while rejecting the social system that created them. The mansions became museums rather than homes, objects to observe rather than spaces to inhabit. But this transformation changed what the buildings meant. As museums, they ceased being living spaces. They became frozen in time, preserved but not used as originally intended. The buildings survived, but their function disappeared. The few mansions that remained in private hands faced different pressures. Owners struggled with how to maintain these properties while navigating contemporary values. Living in a Gilded Age mansion in 2000 felt anachronistic. The scale and grandeur seemed excessive by modern standards. Some owners downplayed their properties. They avoided publicity. They emphasized the building's historical value rather than personal wealth. They tried to separate themselves from the Gilded Age associations their homes carried. The mansions became cultural battlegrounds. They represented competing visions of American identity. To conservatives, they embodied achievement and excellence. To progressives, they symbolized inequality and exploitation. To preservationists, they were architectural treasures. To developers, they were underutilized assets. This disagreement reflected deeper questions about American values. What should the country preserve? What should it celebrate? What relationship should it maintain with its past? The mansions forced Americans to confront these questions every time a demolition was proposed. By 2000, America had developed a schizophrenic relationship with these buildings. The country recognized their artistic value, but remained uncomfortable with their social implications. Americans visited them as tourists, but would not want to live near one. The buildings were admired, but not embraced. This ambivalence shaped how the country remembers the Gilded Age. The period is simultaneously celebrated and criticized. Americans admire the architectural achievement while condemning the inequality that made it possible. The mansions embody this contradiction. The demolished buildings cannot help resolve this tension. They are gone, but their absence shapes the debate. America must confront questions about wealth, achievement, and legacy in the abstract, because the physical monuments that would ground those discussions no longer exist. The new American identity, forged partly through mansion demolition, is more egalitarian than the Gilded Age identity, but it is also more disconnected from its own history. The country chose to destroy rather than adapt its architectural heritage. Whether this choice was necessary or regrettable remains contested. What is certain is that America became a different country by demolishing these buildings. The physical transformation of the landscape changed how Americans understood themselves and their history. The mansion's absence shapes national identity as much as their presence once did. The end of a dream. In the ruins of what once was, America confronts the price of ambition, progress, and the dreams it left behind. The final question remains unanswered. Was the destruction justified? If progress demanded demolition, then the destruction succeeded. America modernized. Cities grew denser. Land use became more efficient. The economic value of urban real estate increased exponentially. By this measure, tearing down mansions was rational. But if cultural preservation matters, then the destruction was catastrophic. America lost irreplaceable architectural treasures. Future generations were deprived of direct contact with significant historical monuments. Knowledge was lost. Beauty was destroyed. By this measure, the demolitions were acts of vandalism. The truth likely lies between these extremes. Some demolitions were necessary, others were not. But the wholesale destruction of 2,000 mansions over 40 years suggests a systematic failure to distinguish between necessary progress and unnecessary destruction. America could have preserved more buildings while still achieving modernization. European cities demonstrate this daily. Paris maintained architectural heritage while becoming a modern metropolis. London preserved historic buildings while accommodating growth. Rome integrated ancient monuments into contemporary urban life. The difference was not technical capacity. American architects and engineers possessed the skills to adapt historic buildings. The difference was values. America prioritized economic efficiency over cultural continuity. Europe made different choices. Those choices reflected cultural differences. American identity emphasized reinvention. The country was founded on rejection of the past. Each generation believed it could improve upon previous generations. This orientation made demolition seem natural. European identity emphasized continuity. Countries with thousand-year histories maintained physical connections to earlier eras. Preserving buildings was preserving collective memory. Demolition felt like cultural suicide. America's decision to demolish created a distinct national character. The country values innovation over tradition, efficiency over beauty, future over past. These values drive economic growth and technological advancement. but they also create a society disconnected from its own history. Whether this disconnection is positive or negative depends on what one values. Those who believe progress requires creative destruction see mansion demolition as necessary. Those who believe culture requires historical continuity see it as tragic. The demolished mansions cannot settle this debate. They are gone. But their loss shapes how Americans think about similar decisions. Every time a historic building faces demolition, the ghost of the Gilded Age mansion boom haunts the discussion. Contemporary preservation movements directly descend from the failure to save these mansions. The legal frameworks protecting historic buildings exist because earlier frameworks failed. The organizations advocating preservation formed in response to demolition. The entire preservation infrastructure emerged from the ashes of demolished mansions. This represents a positive legacy. America learned from its mistakes. The country developed preservation consciousness that did not exist before. Younger generations value historic buildings more than their grandparents did. This cultural shift would not have occurred without the painful lesson of the demolition boom. But the education came at tremendous cost. The buildings that taught the lesson were destroyed in the teaching. Americans learned to value architectural heritage by watching it disappear. The knowledge was bought with irreplaceable loss. Would the country make different choices today? Probably. The legal and cultural infrastructure protecting historic buildings is vastly stronger than it was in 1950. A building that would have been demolished then might be saved now. But economic pressures remain. Land values continue climbing, property taxes increase, maintenance costs rise. The financial logic that made demolition rational in 1950 still applies. Preservation remains expensive and economically challenging. The fundamental tension persists. Individual property rights conflict with collective cultural interests. Owners want to maximize value. Society wants to preserve heritage. Balancing these interests requires constant negotiation and occasional coercion. American law now recognizes this tension and provides mechanisms for balancing competing interests. Historic preservation laws allow government to restrict property rights when buildings have cultural significance. This represents a dramatic shift from the 19th century belief in absolute property rights. But these legal protections came too late for Gilded Age mansions. By the time preservation laws were enacted, most of the buildings were already demolished. The laws protected what remained, but could not resurrect what was lost. The remaining mansions survive primarily as museums. They are maintained through admission fees, donations, and endowments. They are visited by tourists and school groups. They serve educational purposes. But they are not homes. They are monuments to a vanished way of life. This transformation is itself a kind of death. The buildings survive, but their original purpose is gone. They are stage sets rather than living spaces. Beautiful, but no longer functional in their intended sense. The preservation is partial. Perhaps this is the most honest outcome. These buildings were products of a social system that no longer exists and should not be restored. The wealth that built them came from industrial practices that would be unacceptable today. The lifestyle they housed depended on servant labor that is properly extinct. Preserving the buildings as museums allows Americans to acknowledge this history without endorsing it. The mansions become teaching tools. They show what wealth inequality produces. They demonstrate what craftsmanship can achieve. They raise questions about progress, values, and priorities. The demolished mansions serve a different educational function. Their absence teaches. The empty lots parking structures, and office buildings that replace them are daily reminders that everything is temporary. Beauty can be destroyed. History can be erased. Nothing is permanent. This lesson may be more valuable than preservation. America is a young country constantly remaking itself. Understanding that today's monuments may be tomorrow's demolitions encourages humility. It suggests that current assumptions may be questioned by future generations. The Gilded Age families who built these mansions believed they were creating permanent legacies. They were wrong. Their buildings were demolished within a century. This humbles all contemporary ambition. What we build may not last either, but the lesson cuts both ways. If nothing is permanent, then destruction is inevitable. This creates a fatalistic acceptance that undermines preservation efforts. If buildings will eventually be demolished anyway, why fight to save them? The answer is that the timing matters. A building that survives 150 years has fulfilled its purpose better than one demolished after 50. Even temporary preservation has value. Every additional generation that experiences a building multiplies its cultural impact. The demolished Gilded Age mansions lasted between 20 and 70 years. Some served their purpose for a reasonable period. Others were torn down while still relatively new. All could have lasted longer. The destruction was premature. In the end, America must live with the consequences of choices made between 1920 and 1960. The demolished buildings are gone forever. The architectural legacy they represented is largely lost. The cultural continuity they might have provided was severed. Whether this was necessary price for progress or tragic waste of cultural heritage remains debated. What is certain is that America made a choice. The country chose modernization over preservation, efficiency over beauty, future over past. And in making that choice, America became what it is today. A forward-looking nation, uncomfortable with its own history, constantly reinventing itself, permanently restless, unable to settle into the contentment that comes from historical continuity. The demolished mansions are monuments to this restlessness. They were built with ambition, destroyed with indifference, and mourned with nostalgia. They are gone but not forgotten, and their absence shapes American identity as profoundly as their presence once did. The dream of permanence died with the buildings. Nothing remains but memory, photographs, and questions that can never be fully answered. This is the inheritance the demolition boom left to future generations. Loss, regret, and the perpetual question of what might have been.